So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ollie Belcher, and I am the president of the St Edmund Hall Alumni Association. We're delighted that so many of you have joined us today. I believe there are 200 on the call, so thank you. As you may know, the association organises several initiatives for alumni and students, including our annual TEDdy Talk, where alumni form a panel and address a relevant or interesting topic. When COVID hit, we put our TEDdy Talk online, and we've kept it this way so that we can reach a much wider global audience of our 11,000 strong alumni. 2 years ago, we heard from Aularian medics on the front line of COVID. Last year, we addressed the importance of neurodiversity and thinking differently. And this year, we've decided to focus on a very pertinent issue, which is energy security. The International Energy Agency describes energy security as the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. Well, that is certainly not the case now. So with the world in the midst of a global energy crisis, I hope today's panel can explore some key questions about the crisis and what the future holds. So before we start, I'd like to thank Chris Manby from the Association for organising the panel, supported by Emily Bruce from the Development Office. I'd also like to thank Manisha Tank for chairing the panel. Manisha, as you may know, is a well-renowned television news presenter, so we are delighted, Manisha, that you are chairing this important topic today. Thank you. So just before I hand over to Manisha, I wanted to point out that today's talk is recorded, so if there's anyone you know who wanted to be here but couldn't be, they can watch it after. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A function so they can be addressed. Manisha, over to you and the esteemed panel. Thank you.
Ollie, thank you so much. And thank you for entrusting this conversation or the moderation of this conversation to me. It's an absolute honor, and it's wonderful to be with so many wonderful expert Aularians and to connect with so many Aularians all over the world. I'm in Singapore, full disclosure, so it's about 8:30 p.m. here. But I've met Aularians in Hong Kong, where I've lived, in London, in New York. They're absolutely everywhere. So it's great that we're on a platform that connects us all. So as I went about thinking how we were going to navigate this discussion, it occurred to me that energy price inflation has helped us understand what we value the most, hasn't it? And like many of you, I've never really had to worry too much about energy prices until now. And we have a generation of people today who perhaps haven't seen these sorts of prices or felt the kind of pressure, whether it's from climate change or from prices, that we are now feeling. So energy security has always been a bit of a murky business when you start looking at the history and you get into some of the research. And of course, a lot of it hinges on global political relationships and how those are faring. And then, of course, at the recent COP27, and some of our panelists have been involved with it, the UN Secretary General warned us all, and you saw the rather headline, that we're on a road to hell so far as climate change is concerned. So if ever there's a headline to put you in a state of overwhelm, anxiety, and fear, that was definitely one. But the point is, we need positive solutions, and we need to figure out what energy security looks like in the future. So how brilliant then that we have such a wonderful panel of Aularians to help us, each an expert with a spark of knowledge and great ideas that could help us steer this juggernaut onto a brighter destination. And as I began to engage with these guests and do a little bit of research about what they've been up to, I realized that if so much as possible, all of you listening today might think the same thing as me, which was, why didn't we do any of this sooner? So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists. In fact, they're going to introduce themselves, and I'm going to work through them one by one. I would like to start with Christopher Elston. So Christopher studied engineering science in 1976, and he's had a long career in the electricity industry and alternative energy. I won't say anything else. Chris, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, it's Chris Elston. Only my mother used to call me Christopher. So so I came up to the Hall in 1976 and read engineering science. I was fortunate enough to be sponsored by the then nationalised generating board in the UK, and I joined them after I graduated, became a professional engineer, and stayed for 40 years in the electricity generation industry. And in that time, I've touched more or less every form of electricity generation. So coal, oil, nuclear, hydro, wind, I think even a bit of consultancy work later on fusion energy. The only thing I haven't done is solar power, but I might yet put some panels up on my roof just to complete the picture. And in my career, I've done all sorts of things with power stations. I've been involved in operation and maintenance, construction, engineering, mergers and acquisitions, lots of things. So yes, power stations and electricity generation has been my thing.
Okay, I am just sharing a picture of one of the power stations. I think you shared this with us. Hopefully everyone can see that. So this is...
yeah, that's okay. So that's Drax Power Station there. I was engineering manager at Drax. Drax, 4,000 megawatts. And at the time I was there, and I think at the time this photograph was taken, was the biggest coal-fired power station in Western Europe. Yeah, bit out of fashion these days.
Yes. Now, Chris, I know that you have shared some other photographs with us. Would you like to hold on to these, until later in our conversation?
Yeah, let's bring in the other panelists and then we can come back to those.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that one. Just full disclosure to all of our guests who are online today, I'm not the best with PowerPoint, but I'm doing my whatever I can. Okay, let's go now to Susanna. Anna, as you can probably tell from her backdrop, is joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh. And we all know, hopefully, if you've been reading the news, what's been happening there recently. Susanna Hancock read Anthropology 2013. Susanna, you describe yourself as a champion for social and environmental change. We need a lot of that right now. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So, thank you, Manisha, and thank you, everyone, for having me here. I am indeed in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, where I've been pretty involved in panels and discussions and negotiations for the past 10 days or so. But I am an Arctic explorer and climate researcher. I'm just back from recreating an expedition from 150 years ago that tried to reach the first to the North Pole. So I was there doing some climate research. What had changed in an area, specifically an area that's warming about 7 times faster than the rest of the world. So it's much faster than the rest of the Arctic, as well as the global average. But I started as a scientist when I was 4. I wanted to be an astrophysicist. And at around age 11, I became interested in polar science because the place is warming so much faster and it holds so many keys to understanding global risk and global impact. Sea level rise, for example, just as energy security. And I now head up a team of global scientists and climate risk leaders from around the world. And we speak science to power, addressing specifically CEOs and business leaders and those with direct decision-making power. I also work as an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and am president of some early career Association for Polar Early Career Scientists and some other work with the UN. So that's traveling around a lot by train. Generally speaking, I did get here by land, so try to stay out of the air. But yeah, that's me. So thank you again.
Great stuff. Thank you for joining us so much, Susanna. I know that you have a lot on your plate right now. So thank you for joining us from Egypt. Let's go now to Dr. Ryan Law, 1990, geology, founder and managing director of geothermal engineering. It doesn't take much of a guess to know which field he's in. Ryan, how are you doing? And tell us a little bit more about you.
Thank you for the introduction. And yes, good to see some of you. Pity we can't see everybody who is on the call. So you're right, I did study earth sciences or geology back in 1990. And of course, everybody said at the time, what on earth would you do with that? Well, funnily enough, I didn't really know either. But I think it started then with getting a perspective of time, geological time, and our impacts on both climate and the environment over the 3 million or so years we've been around. I was lucky enough. I then ended up at Arup, the consulting engineers, and started working in a field that was then known as ground energy. So we started working. This was maybe 15, 20 years ago. On most of the buildings, new buildings in London, who you probably would not know are heated and cooled from geothermal energy. And then I went out 2008 and formed GEL, I obviously clearly got obsessed with drilling deeper and deeper. So we sort of started with a couple of 100 meters in London, and we finished with 5.2 kilometers in Cornwall. So it's a whole sort of spectrum of geology, heating, cooling, and now power and potentially zero carbon minerals from deep geothermal resources.
Ryan, thanks very much for that. I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit later about the potential of geothermal energy. And I come from Southampton, and I know that Southampton has been a center for that kind of research for a long time as well. So that's quite exciting for me in terms of where I came from. Okay, let's now go to William Young, 2001 Modern History. Will, I'm not going to read out the note that I have, which is a very long sentence that explains what you do. I'm going to leave that to you.
Not enough full stops. Okay, good. So yes, thanks, Manisha. I guess over the last 18 years, I've been essentially building a business that provides data and insight to investors and corporations and policymakers who are trying to navigate this low carbon transition, or the energy transition and the energy system generally. And that essentially means, in concrete terms, that we take the huge array of public information and sort of semi-private information and try and make sense of it for our clients, so that they can make smarter decisions when they're investing or making policy choices. When that information isn't available, we really essentially try and go out and find new information or create new data sets so that they can essentially evaluate their choices more effectively. And in some ways, having read Modern History, it's a hardcore research job, taking vast numbers of amounts of information and essentially making sense of that. So certainly drawing on my time at Teddy Hawk.
Yeah, and of course, and so can I just to sort of, this is your work with GFANZ. So I just need to point out that GFANZ is not a fan group for a K-pop band. GFANZ is something else. I've had people make that mistake. But just tell us very briefly something about that.
Yeah, so the underlying business is Bloomberg NEF, which is essentially a division of the wider Bloomberg empire. Within that, I run a number of different things, one of which happens to be a research program that we do for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, founded, I guess, last year. Mark Carney led, Mike Bloomberg led, essentially a trade or umbrella group for the financial system, and everything from asset managers to insurers to banks to otherwise. And they're really trying to grapple with, how do you do net zero? So we're helping them with data and research. We're essentially a research supplier to that trade association.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. And thank you for clarifying. Okay, last but by no means least, we have Dr. Andrew Hagan, who I want to point out is in Glasgow. And he says he just hung out after the last COP26. No, not really. Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, yep, I studied chemistry at Teddy Hall and then went on to do a PhD. So I studied chemistry for 7 years, but clearly was no good because I'm still stuck on the first element, hydrogen, where I work now. So, I've done some commercial studies as well. So done my MBA, politics, economics, law over the years. Worked for companies like Air Liquide and Shell in the energy sector, latterly managing east of France and Netherlands for one of their products before I moved to the World Economic Forum, where I worked a lot on climate change and sustainability and set up a collaborative innovation platform so I could bring in all the key stakeholders, the energy industry, C-suites, chemical, transport logistics, etc., and also with policymakers and civil society. And we did address what we're working on now. I mean, I did lots of projects on energy security, new sources of energy storage, batteries at grid scale, at medium scale for cars, and at micro scale for laptops and phones, but also worked on hydrogen as part of that, and kept my interest up in hydrogen. Back then, 10 years ago, we called it hydrogen 3.0. I now call it hydrogen 4.0. I've kept up the interest. When I left the World Economic Forum after 10 years as a director, I then kept consulting independently to the C-suites and startups on sustainability, from circular economy through to energy security, through to including hydrogen. And when a couple of the people I'd brought into the World Economic Forum said they were thinking of starting a business on hydrogen, I said I'd be very interested. And we said, well, why did it not take off last time? And we saw there was a lack of synchronicity between demand and supply. When there's a lack of synchronicity between demand and supply in any market, it will never take off. So we said, how do we bridge that gap? How do we get through that? And we said, we'll build out the infrastructure for hydrogen. So we're effectively, the company we started, Element 2, was just before the first lockdowns in 2020. We said, we're going to build out these hydrogen refueling stations. We'll buy hydrogen at one price. We'll sell it at another through the medium of these refueling stations. We had never actually physically met for over 1.5 years as a management team because of the lockdown. So I say we're a company that was born with COVID as our midwife. But we have grown, I mean, extremely quickly since then. In terms of valuation and what we're doing, we've done demonstrations in Inverness, in Oban. We're doing them in Tees Valley since before last Christmas. In the last few weeks, we've had a transport minister come to our site to test out and do some hydrogen refueling. 2 weeks later, she was not in post. Then we had a Secretary of State for Transport come to our hydrogen refueling site with the Combined Authority Mayor, Ben Harchin, and made an announcement for some funding. And 2 weeks later, she was not in post. So the flip side to our hydrogen refueling stations is that we're a deathbed for any transport minister or secretary. Come here to ruin your career. But no, it's taken off, and this interest has grown a lot quicker than we could have ever have imagined. Our strapline though is make diesel history, not make diesel history through hydrogen. We understand there are horses for courses, and hydrogen has to play its part where it should play its part. There is not one silver bullet for solving this energy crisis. Hydrogen has a role to play, but it is a role. I will come into my 4 Rs potentially later. The right source of hydrogen with the right technology for the right application in the right place, but it's not a panacea for the solutions.
Sure.
I would leave it at that so that we can go into the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you all for that little preamble and for all introducing yourselves. And it helps us understand, where you're all coming from so many different angles on this particular story. So Christopher, I'm going to round it back to you, or sorry, Chris, since only your mother calls you Christopher. Okay, how did we get here? It's easy for people to say, this is about Russia, this is about Ukraine, this is global politics, sanctions, the whole thing. But actually, this energy crisis that we're facing is decades in the making. And I think, and I'm sure many would agree, that it's a series of mistakes, isn't it, that got us to this stage?
Series of mistakes. I'm not entirely sure it's a series of mistakes. I think there's always going to be unforeseen circumstances that will arise. Poor strategy, maybe. Can we come to that a bit later? And I think it might be helpful if I sort of set the scene and we do a quick canter through what's happened in the energy industry, particularly in the UK, in the last sort of 30 or so years. So if we go back to the period before 1990, it was actually, in hindsight, a bit of a golden age for energy security. We had coal, we had nuclear, something like 80% of our electricity was generated by coal, and that was pretty well exclusively, as far as I'm aware, UK coal. We had North Sea oil and gas, which was reaching its peak of production. Oil was relatively secure, although we did have price shocks caused by international market developments. Some will be aware, obviously, the price shocks in the 1970s and so on. But we were more or less self-sufficient in energy. And there was this diversity of energy supply as well. And the robustness of that system, I think, was demonstrated very well by the 1985 coal miners' strike, where we managed to get through a very prolonged strike with, as far as I can remember, no power cuts, no disconnections, and difficult though it may have been at the time, the energy industry survived. Environmental concerns were largely around acid rain and nuclear waste. There were a lot of people not so sure about nuclear energy, had bad associations with the atomic weapons program. But that was the situation in 1990. Around 1990, the energy industry became to be privatized, starting with electricity. Things were liberalized. It became possible to burn gas. It became possible to import coal because it was no longer a number of nationalized industries dealing with one another. So there was a flight from coal and a dash to gas. And that meant that eventually something like today, roughly 40% of our electricity is generated by gas. Many more independent power producers came along that could build gas-fired power stations. There are lots of reasons for that I won't go into, but we can deal with if people are curious. And then we had an increasing concern about climate change. And from having had a liberalized market, the market was then tweaked to allow the development of renewable energy, in particular wind, and then also burning biomass. So that was the situation really up until the present time. But what we're seeing is that North Sea oil and gas production is declining, and now down to about 50% of our gas, for example, has to be imported. And that's why situations like Ukraine and so on are causing such a problem. And the fact that the gas doesn't belong to the British government, it's like the producers are licensed and they trade on an international market. But from a security point of view, we have to import about 50% of our gas, a lot of that from Norway, some is liquefied natural gas from Qatar. Renewable generation has seen a massive increase. And again, something like 40% of our electricity is now generated by renewables, wind and biomass. But that's a huge success story for the UK, which again, I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more later on. One of the features of privatization, the liberalization of the electricity market, was that what I like to call mega projects became very, very difficult to do commercially. And therefore, all the power stations we've built since then have been relatively simpler to build. Can you bring up, Manisha, there's a picture of Pembroke Power Station on the...
Sure, I'm going to try. Bear with me.
Show us that, because that's a prime example. In fact, it's the apotheosis. There's a Greek word for any classic scholars that we've got online. So that's Pembroke Power Station. If you press the slideshow button, it might come up a bit quicker. Bottom, that's the one. A bit bigger rather. So that's the last project that I was responsible for when working for the company that became npower, and that's a combined cycle gas turbine power station. It may look pretty complex, but relative to the kind of projects that were being built pre-1990, it was a relatively straightforward project to do. So just wrapping up this section then, nuclear power stations, because of the sheer scale of them, we've had little or no investment in nuclear. There is actually a photo of Hinkley Point C, which is one of EDF's projects being built in Somerset. I don't know if you can bring that up, Manisha, just to show people what a mega project looks like in construction.
Hang on.
That's the one. I've snaffled that from EDF's website, so thanks to them. But you can see the sheer scale, the number of cranes, and it maybe doesn't even come across in that photograph, the massive size of those projects. It's probably something, 20 times the order of magnitude in terms of cost, 20 times, 15 times the cost of Pembroke that we saw a moment ago. So nuclear is declining. We're heavily reliant on gas. We have renewables. We have no coal anymore. We have some biomass, and climate change concerns are intensifying. So that brings us right up, I think, to the modern age, Manisha.
Okay, brilliant. We've actually had our first question. Well, we've had a few questions come in from our audience. And before I move on to our next panelist, I actually want to put, if you wouldn't mind just answering this very quickly, from Hugh Bruce Gardine. Surviving the miners' strike was mostly about stockpiling coal ahead of the strike. Isn't that the failure of strategy here, reduction in gas storage capacity?
Yeah, partly true. Yes, that is partly true. So you're quite right to say what we need for energy security, one of the things we need is storage, so that we can deal with medium and probably medium-term threats to availability. And coal was brilliant for energy storage, as in a way was nuclear, because the fuel lasts so long, you only need to refuel on a very, very long time scale. We've never had a huge amount of gas storage in the UK. And what we had was being run on a commercial basis rather than a strategic energy needs basis. And it became quite expensive to run. And the biggest site was called Rough. It's based on a gas field in the North Sea called Rough. And that was actually decommissioned because it was simply too expensive to maintain and not paying its way in the market. Now, of course, with the Ukraine situation, things have rather changed. That is being brought back into service, and I think now runs at about 30% of its theoretical peak capacity. But yes, other countries do have much more gas storage. I think we were relying on the fact that we had North Sea gas. North Sea gas is now down, I think, did I mention, to about 50% of its peak production, and may well phase out altogether, some people say, by about 2030. So yes, ideally we would have more gas storage. In Germany, for example, they have a huge amount. I think Rough at the moment can maybe supply 1% of UK winter gas demand. The Germans, I think, have possibly got about 30% storage. So yeah, but the energy industry has not been driven by strategy so much as by a liberalized market, in the hope that liberalized markets would do all the right things to ensure price and security.
Thanks very much for answering that question for us. Not a question, just a statement from Chetan Ladd. Chris, Drax is still going, but fired by biomass instead of coal. It's now West Europe's biggest decarbonisation project. I worked for them for a couple of years. Thank you very much for that comment.
Yeah, good. It's good to see another Drax alumnus on the line. I have a little bit of a beef myself with biomass, and I'll just state very briefly what that is. We have an acute climate problem, and that acute climate problem needs to be dealt with over the next 2-3 decades, even quicker if we believe Mr. Gutierrez, as you quoted, I think, in your introduction, maybe Manisha. Biomass, we're cutting down trees, we're burning them and hoping that trees will grow that will take the CO2 out of the atmosphere. There is an argument that it takes the CO2 out too late to help us with the climate crisis that we have. It's an argument.
Thank you for that, Chris, because you've helped me transition neatly to Susanna, who is in Sharm el-Sheikh, who's been attending COP27. Susanna, your call to action is very much ditch fossil fuels now, but many goods require oil as a basic component. And even our electric cars need to be lubricated in the future as well. So there's a balance to be struck in terms of what we do with fossil fuels. But of course, as a fuel, we want to phase this out. I get that. We've actually had, it's not a question, it's a statement from Steve Russell. Chris has summarized electricity generation, but energy is much wider than this. It is, isn't it, Susanna? So I think it's a good juncture at which you can kind of talk to us about how environmental security is wrapped up with energy security and the fact that we do have lots of options, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say that my internet was flaking out a moment ago during the last couple of minutes. So if I lose off, I apologize for that. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been using renewable energies in the form of mostly hydro, but also wind for a couple thousand years. So, this isn't, technologies are obviously rapidly changing, but the idea of something that's not fossil fuel is certainly something that we've been going for a long time. But I think with, where I come from, looking at fossil fuels is that we have the fossil fuel industry that has been actively suppressing information and framing what's going on. We have 7 million people a year who are dying of air pollution, lung diseases caused by air pollution. We're having an emissions gap that we're not able to close with the continuation of fossil fuels. As somebody who works in the Arctic, Greenland right now, we've destabilized that ice sheet so much that even if we stopped all fossil fuels now, we still have committed about 24 centimeters of sea level rise. And that's saying that nothing's happening beyond that in terms of fossil fuel development. So, we have set ourselves up for situations, and we're living in situations where our lives are at stake. We have people who are dying, their livelihoods are dying. The countries are needing, we have countries that have evacuation plans for the country, have communities that have relocated. And that's because of our past dependence on fossil fuels. So we have not just is energy security, environmental security, do they go hand in hand? They go hand in hand, not just in the whole needing access to fossil fuels as a form of home energy security or the international diplomacy that we get into, with Russia cutting off its fossil fuel lines, and how else do we get these? And a lot that are coming up from Africa now, and what is that doing with the colonial legacy? That's certainly one of the topics here at COP right now. But also with this past reliance on fossil fuels, how is that creating our personal security as a people, and what kind of security do we get that is on more renewable areas? So, and just the pollution that we're causing, whether it's Deepwater Horizon, Exxon Valdez, rivers that are burning in locations, people no longer have fresh water to drink. There's water insecurity, international conflict, food insecurity. These are all things that are affecting our own personal security as related to energy security. So the topics right now that are key here, loss and damages, certainly one, and time of implementation, saying that this is the 27th COP, it's time to stop talking and time to get moving. Been time for that. But how do we actually create that just transition so that we are, saying we have the technologies, we just need to implement them, we need to invest in them. I don't need countries like my own, the United States, investing in fossil fuel developments elsewhere in the world, which it's doing now to bring energy to other places, but it's ravaging the earth and the environment doing so. We could be investing that same money in cleaner technology. And that gives that kind of more holistic approach to energy and environmental security.
Susanna, I'm so glad you brought that up. So let's get into some of the alternatives. This is not meant to be a debate between renewables and fossil fuels, but I think it's about how do we actually reach a balance, and how do we transition to a much cleaner future. Let's bring in Ryan. Ryan, obviously oil and gas, they're not the only options, right? I remember watching Tomorrow's World a very long time ago. Tells everyone how old I am. And I remember the first feature I ever saw on the wonder of geothermal energy. But that was a long, long time ago. And what I'm curious about, and Susanna was just talking about this, about investment in other options. I read an incredible article the other day, and it was all about, and it had actually been published by Oxfam, the original research, showing that billionaires spew out far more carbon emissions than most ordinary people because they're investing in fossil fuel-based technologies or companies. What would happen if these billionaires were investing in, say, geothermal, for example?
Well, lots would happen, but lots is happening, yeah, in the same breath. So I think Chris gave a really good summary of sort of electricity, but there's another sort of elephant in the room when we talk about energy, which is heat. Yeah. So we're doing fairly well in the UK and other countries on increasing our renewable electricity supply, and yes, there are issues associated with that. But what we're not getting on top of, and what is extremely difficult, is heat. So in the UK alone, we use close to 50% of our primary energy consumption on heat. And over the years, the government, and we can talk about policy, we can talk about strategy and how that is fairly difficult when we have a different energy minister almost yearly. But the ultimate problem is how do we shift heat production from burning stuff to not burning stuff? And certainly where geothermal has come in, and one of the reasons you're probably not so aware of it is because you don't really see it in the UK, because everything is underground, is finding methods of decarbonizing heat. And I think where you're talking about investment, what we're seeing is despite a lot of problems and potentially a lot of doom and gloom with regards to where we're going with the climate, the investment climate for both renewable electricity and renewable heat and renewable transportation, those three big consumers of energy, is starting to change, and particularly changed over the last 18 months, even prior to the whole COVID scenario, and particularly prior to Ukraine, which really started to shift people's mindsets on how we consume energy, how we produce energy, and how we fund it. So I think there's an inevitable shift from oil and gas companies into renewable sectors. But critically, your question is those sorts of investments, particularly from the oil and gas industry, are substantial. So they're billions of pounds per project. And where we have to get to with heat is somehow find scales of delivery that can attract that scale of investment. Because converting someone's boiler to a heat pump on a singular basis is never going to attract that level of private investment. So heat is, and I'll be honest, we work in it a lot. It is a very difficult problem to solve. And there's a number of different solutions on the table in this country as well, but we have to get our heads around it and get around it quickly. How do we address heat supply, heat usage, and longer term, introducing people maybe to the concept of not having their own gas boiler in their house? Back to your initial discussion.
Yeah, and a quick follow-up on that, as we get back to the energy security conversation, of course, as a layperson, someone might think, well, that geothermal energy is right beneath my feet. I'm not relying on a foreign power. I'm not having to rely on someone having to do some deal to make sure that I will have heat in my home in the midst of winter. How important is that in the conversation right now?
I think it's shifting people's mentalities. And, throw my cards on the table, I did convert my house to geothermal heating 20 years ago. Okay. So it's something that can be done, not in all circumstances, but ultimately we'll still use electricity to drive the system. So you'll never entirely disconnect from a grid. And perhaps we can talk, I don't think we'll have time. We could talk about that later in terms of where the grid might be going. But I think all of us will still be connected in some way to a centralized power structure. But yeah, nothing wrong with developing geothermal in your back garden, if you do have a back garden.
Sounds expensive, but we can talk about that another time, perhaps. Let's bring in Andrew. So actually, and I'm quite curious about this off-grid. Why not? Let's talk about it. Andrew, you are an advocate for going the highway, as in the first element. And it's a similar question really for you. How can you just tell us how you expect the hydrogen industry in Britain to evolve? Where are we right now with it? And also, is it a viable option? There are still a lot of people who think hydrogen and they see in their minds, a picture of an airship exploding. So how do you reassure people? How is that secure?
I'll comment a little bit on some of the other things you've been talking about. I mean, the whole issue of climate change has been around for a long, long time. Thatcher even brought it up in one of her speeches in the 80s to the UN. I think it possibly in her first speech. We went through the Stern report, which was a huge, wake-up call, which we chose to look at and say, that's nice. We should definitely pay attention to that and not do much on it. COP14 back in Copenhagen, there was a huge momentum and people were very interested. Nothing happened. And then we went through climate change fatigue language. And so interest was dropped for a bit. But we're talking about energy security. You mentioned climate security as well. I mean, it's been called the energy trilemma for a long time. When we first developed that idea back at the World Economic Forum, it was between those two and also water. But recently up in Aberdeen with the World Energy Council, we were talking about that third prong being the just transition. And that has many, implications, and we don't have time to go into it today. But one of the biggest ones for me is the climate refugees that are almost certainly going to happen in a bigger scale than they are happening now. So where are we in hydrogen? Sorry, coming back to that. Well, everyone that has been mentioned so far, whether it's EDF, Hinkley Point C, whether it's Pembroke, the region, whether it's Drax, whether it's Arup, they all have hydrogen strategies and are moving to hydrogen in a big way. When you talk about Hindenburg, yes, the airship that blew up, it was never, ever meant to run on hydrogen. One day they didn't have helium, so they said, what can we get instead? We'll go for hydrogen. There was no safety analysis, no safety preparation. And that is one of the first things we do at Element 2. We will survey the site. We will go there and make sure all the safety aspects are in place. Health and safety comes first. The tanks that we have, the cylinders in our mobile dispensing units, they are literally shot 4 times in a row with an armor-piercing bullet. So they are literally bulletproof. they're dropped from a height of 5 meters onto solid concrete and nothing happens. So the safety aspect has gone up a huge amount. Where are we in the UK now? As I mentioned earlier, I called it hydrogen 3.0 back in 2009-10. We're now at hydrogen 4.0. You've seen a huge amount of investment. You've seen a huge amount of hype and certain politicians wanting to be the Saudi Arabia of the hydrogen world, a renewable world. I'm not sure linking ourselves to Saudi Arabia is a good idea, or likening to Saudi, but certainly there's a huge potential. And the grid question is a big one because we have a huge amount of constrained power when it's windy. On a windy day in Scotland, you could power at least 6 Scotlands. So we have an excess of energy that we're not capturing. And hydrogen is one of the ways to do that. There are other ways. I mean, the battery storage at grid scale, you cannot keep that inertia, was one of the problems we found when we were analyzing that. But you can do certain things, whether it's the storage as the Norwegians do in their hydro plants, or whether you turn it into hydrogen. And lots of people are looking at doing that. The business models that the big competition through BEIS for literally, I mean, you're looking at 100 billion there. The strand 3 million, sorry, strand 3 of that is around the electrolyzers. So you take electrolyzer, basically you take water, put it through the electrolyzer, it splits into hydrogen and oxygen. You need the oxygen for things like water treatment or hospitals, but the hydrogen can go into industries such as chemical and steel that cannot decarbonize another way, but also road transport, which is what we're looking at. You've seen since 2016, Aberdeen has had hydrogen buses. They've got 2 hydrogen refueling stations there, not one accident so far. So safety has been well taken into account. London has a refueling station from hydrogen, as does Birmingham, and they both have buses. You're looking at clean air zones because there is 0 particulate matter from a hydrogen fuel cell. And there's a lot of talk about it right now. As I said, 2 transport ministers came to our sites to make announcements. Is one of the key aspects for the UK, because we have that wind power, we have solar. We can be producing lots of hydrogen and exporting that should we choose to. In terms of the grid, for me, even the current strategy, you'd probably have to at least triple the grid size. It does not have the capacity right now, and that's not free. They had to stop building houses in West London because they do not have the grid capacity. You have had a huge amount of technical progress. The fuel cells, they've been around for some time, but they're getting bigger and more powerful. You can travel huge distances. I mean, was it Volkswagen just said they're developing a car that can travel 1,000 kilometers on one tank of hydrogen? You're looking at the HGVs, the 44-ton trucks, and that's where we really want to have an effect, because for each kilogram of hydrogen, that amounts to about 5.6 liters of diesel, which is effectively abating 12 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So that's a 1:12 ratio. I mean, some others have got different calculations, but the whole transport market was possibly 37% of the end user market of generating CO2 emissions, 7.7 gigatons in 2021, which was an increase of 8%. So it's a huge sector that we need to address. And the last week, Global Energy Outlook from the IEA said that the peak oil will heavily depend on that transport sector.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna jump in there because there's so much going on in the hydrogen space. And as you were speaking, we were receiving lots of questions, including questions around how do you harness this and store this energy, particularly around the time you were talking about the wind in Scotland, and then as you described some of the potential here. Let's come back to that. I want to park it for a second because Ryan has been Will has been waiting very patiently. I think this is a great juncture to move to you, Will, because the stuff that Andrew was talking about, and he gave lots of very specific examples there, but I think the key is scale. And for scale, you need finance. And this is something you know all about. Perhaps you can just explain what it's going to take to get us where we need to be when we do have so many options and we've got such an important balance to strike.
For sure. And I'm always entertained when we hear about the challenge being finance. Typically when people complain about there being a lack of finance to get to scale and things like that, it fundamentally means that the economics suck in any given project or any given industry. And so money will flow just like people wherever there is something attractive. And so I think that's an exciting thing in some ways, and it's a challenging thing in others. I guess the exciting thing over the last 10 years, 7 or 8 years actually, is that there's been a recognition or a widespread understanding. And I say widespread because it's even reached, you know, Ban Ki-moon at the top of the UN General Assembly or the United Nations back in 2015, that the economics of alternatives have changed dramatically, and essentially the cost of those have dropped substantially, whether it's 80% in solar or whether it's 70% in offshore wind and so on. So when you say scale, Manisha, and when you talk about finance, those underlying economics and the learning curves that have come from essentially the iteration of small types of energy generation, and going back to the point that Chris made right at the beginning, we're doing much simpler power generation projects. We're doing much simpler other sources of energy. And that has allowed people to scale and do multiple iterations. And that's basically been able to bring the costs down. So offshore wind is a fantastic UK example there. But going back to your point on sort of the sort of where's the money been going to some extent, it is worth remembering that to Chris's point on the liberalized power market sort of dependence there, the UK did on the gas supply side of things essentially switch from a domestic supply to a reliance on multiple diverse sources, whether that's interconnectors, whether that's Norway, whether that's Qatar, whether that's wherever. And in some ways, that's been proven right. Like, we have managed to have no real fears of the interruption of supply. Prices have been awful, but there's no real fear of interruption of supply. And that's something that other countries have really struggled with, Germany, for example. So I think that's worth remembering, if that answers your question, Manisha.
I just want to follow up though. So the supply is there. We have options in terms of where we can get our energy from. But what puts the lid on something that so many Britons, not just Britons, people all over the world are worrying about right now is, how do I keep the lights on? How do I pay the bills? How do we get ahead of this pop in energy prices? What's going to happen in the future as we transition based on our expectations of climate, based on what we need to do? Is energy going to be more expensive for most of us, or are the prices going to come down? Do we even know?
Could I take a liberty and maybe pop up the 3 slides? Actually, it does link into this. So, and I'm sure other colleagues will have views on this too. But the first slide is essentially the switch in Russian oil and gas. So this is from the IEA, which Andrew mentioned, the outlook that they had for the supply of oil and gas from Russia, particularly on the export side of things. What we're going through right now is this substantial shift. And I do get a little bit tired when we say it's an energy crisis. At heart, this is an oil and gas crisis. So the shift that we're seeing, the restructuring of the energy market away from Russian supply, is in part why we're spending so much money right now. It is shifting contracts, it is shifting supply sources away. And so I think one thing is, over the next 2 or 3 years, we are just shifting supply away from Russia. Now, that does mean we'll probably end up building and investing more in oil and gas outside Russia and in more friendly markets. And that will provoke a political challenge because not everybody's supportive of that, but fundamentally, it's kind of necessary. The second slide, though, is actually, if you look a little bit further ahead, we don't want to build in too many other dependencies, so to speak. So this is rare earth production. And when we talk about keeping a lid on future costs or risks, if you think about electric vehicles, if you think about wind turbines, they essentially have components within them, permanent magnets, etc., which are dependent on rare earths. And this is a chart of the production of those rare earths. And you can see it's rest of world, People's Republic of China. The interesting thing here is that scary dependence that we thought we had on China there is being managed down. Now, it's so far been managed down mainly by the US, by Korea, by Japan, who are most exposed early on. But if you're talking about keeping a lid on not only consumer costs, but also fundamental supply risks, then you need to keep pushing on this and move into the refining, etc., which I think Ryan and others have been looking at. So that's an important point there. You've also mentioned, and I'm jumping into the next slide here, the sort of dependence on third countries, so to speak. And I think we must, at times, you know, we know that energy sovereignty, so to speak, is really important. We need to have more secure supplies, but we also need to remember that actually we are in a fairly interrelated world. And this is an image of two essentially diplomats meeting a senior manager at Eskom, the South African utility. And I think this brings it back to the points that Susanna is making, which are fundamentally, you need to drive down coal for climate. And this group, this was the first indication that these sort of bilateral deals were going to happen, where, you know, countries like the US and the UK were going to do deals with South Africa to reduce their coal dependence and shift over to renewables, so achieving, as far as possible, essentially the realignment of emerging markets and developing economies around climate goals, whilst acknowledging this sort of security of supply risks. Now, the point I'm making here is not that this is the solution to everything, but that actually international in relationships, be it with Qatar on gas, be it with Norway on gas, be it with Europe on interconnections, etc., or on climate, be it with, you know, South Africa or Indonesia, etc., are fairly crucial to keeping a lid on the fundamental risks in an interconnected world like this. I'll pause there. Oh, we muted you, Manisha.
No, I think I muted myself. Thank you for pointing that out. I was just resetting my screen, so just as well. And with that, it's a great place to transition back to Chris, actually. Chris, Will got me thinking about something there, which is when it comes to energy security, I'm being an idealist. Can you ever imagine a world in which, you know, we all work together? We have whatever is powering wherever we're getting our energy from. You know, back in the Cold War, this term mutually assured destruction. I'm a PPEist. We talked about these things quite a bit, but it was all, you know, we're not going to nuke each other because we all die, right? It doesn't work. We need to work together, not against each other. Okay, we know how these things have panned out, but with climate change on the horizon and with all the options that we have available, and the fact that different countries have access to different sources of energy or are at a different stage along the curve when it comes to R&D or investment or whatever it might be, can we envision a future where we work together better when it comes to energy security? Now, Chris, you're on mute.
Yes. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think you're probably asking the wrong person, because that's something of a political question rather than a technical question. But certainly, it does require a degree of cooperation, which I don't think we've really seen, apart from possibly, the example that springs to mind is the holding the ozone layer, where there was international cooperation, and that problem is largely solved. So it does require international cooperation. I think one thing I would say, though, is that if we zoom in just to look at, for example, the UK, there isn't really a conflict between energy security and zero carbon, because I think, and colleagues, I think probably would agree with this, that the technologies we're looking at for energy security and for low carbon are not mutually exclusive at all. Now, I take the comments that Will made recently about, just a moment ago, about rare earths and certain specialist materials, but geothermal, hydrogen, nuclear, yes, we need to import the nuclear fuel, but largely we're talking about things which would give us energy security. I think the other political problem that we've got is that I think the cost will go up, and we might see the sort of costs that we're paying at the moment being a permanent feature in the future. But certainly it is a problem that requires international cooperation. There's no point us going for zero carbon if the rest of the world isn't doing it.
I know, Andrew, you want to jump in. Go ahead.
So, yeah, I mean, you mentioned the mutually assured destruction of nuclear, but that is a massive impact instantaneously. Climate change is a gradual process, but it's going to have the equal effect, and it is exponential. I mean, we don't quite know how to picture exponential. I give a very, very easy way for children in Ireland, where I say filling the Aviva with water 1 drop at a time, double the drops every 30 seconds. How long before it's half full? no one guesses it's 21 minutes. How long we're flowing? 21 and a half. It's that quick. It's that scale that we're going to see the change on. The fact that we are all interrelated in energy security already. I mean, that's why we have the crisis when someone like Russia causes issues in other areas. And The Economist did a good 3 scenarios with Rystad Energy on playing that out. But we're sitting now with 1.2 million tons of LNG sitting off the coast of Europe because others are coming to help. It is already connected. It's already working together. It needs to be done with both that and climate in mind. And that's where Susanna being at COP27 probably hopefully brings home some good results.
And to add, perhaps the acute cost of this current energy crisis is falling very heavily on developing countries that are being priced out. And the same thing will happen if we go for zero carbon energy, because they are more expensive. The reason we don't do it partly is it's so much more expensive. And I think Will again said the projects suck. Well, that's because there are cheaper alternatives.
Yeah, the economics.
I said the renewable projects suck, but yes.
Susanna, can I bring you in if you would unmute yourself? So here's the thing. COP27, actually, the issue of sort of climate justice came up quite a bit. But also, are people talking? So there's 2 things there. You can talk about the climate justice. Andrew just mentioned that. But also, I'm just looking through the Q&A. We've had a couple of questions actually about nuclear. Is that something that came up at COP27? What are the kind of discussions around that? What is your feeling as an environmentalist around it?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So, just jumping on the nuclear, and I know there's another thing on there on hydrogen as well. There have been a few conversations, certainly around the idea, and we've just started the 2nd week today, so we've got a lot more of these negotiations, discussions that are going to come out of this. But that, yes, some of these are more expensive, especially if we're investing in other countries where there isn't this technology, but the cost of not doing this is going to be so much greater. And that's, talking about that beaker where you're doubling the amount of water that you're dropping in and you get 21 minutes and 21 and a half minutes. I mean, that's sort of the rate of scale of our lack of action or delaying action. So saying that something is more expensive now, so we're not going to go there. Well, it's going to be exponentially more expensive not to go there later. And that's one of the big issues here in terms of the loss and damages and investments implementation that I think is going to really set whether this COP is seen as being successful in any way, whether it can really get that through. And that ties into what you're talking about, the mutually assured destruction. I think one difference when you had the US and the Soviet Union, and that completely predates me, so I'm not part of, I don't know this any firsthand, but when you're having 2 superpowers who are really focused on themselves, and they'd be directly impacted, as would obviously other people, but here it's the people with the money and the people with control are not the people who are most affected. So I think it's a little bit of a different dynamic. We're seeing, and this getting into the climate justice side, we're seeing that those people who are most affected are women, are people in small island developing states, indigenous populations. It's, the climate crisis is cutting directly on economic and racial gender lines. So I think that's sort of a key element. But also just picking up a moment ago on Chris, you mentioned the ozone layer, which I think is really not so much a solved issue. We're discovering more issues with ozone now, but going back to the 1980s, the Vienna and Geneva conventions that both identified the phase out of the chlorofluorocarbons and made that international commitment to it and then had the implementation. Those were the first 2 UN treaties that were unanimously signed by every single person in the world. So, there is interest in this global working together. And it's just, So then nuclear, haven't had many discussions about nuclear. I think there's some concerns about, needing to solve issues of waste before it's taken too seriously. It is part of the discussion, but we have sort of this elephant in the room that hasn't really been accepted as a solution yet. But certainly on hydrogen, that definition, the distinction, hydrogen it is still a greenhouse gas. It's what we call an indirect greenhouse gas. So it's not necessarily polluting in the same way carbon dioxide, but it mixes with
Okay, I'm going to jump in because I know time is short and I think we might have lost Susanna. She did say that she had a ropey connection. Can I just check in with our organizers, because I still have a couple of questions to ask our panelists, and I would love to hear from Ryan because he's been very patiently and leaning back there listening to the conversation, and I wanted to see if he can I just check in with you, Ollie, and our organizers, if we can just continue for a little while longer?
Yes, I mean, I think it was meant to be an hour, but it's obviously such a huge topic with so many opinions. If people are happy to stay on the line for a little bit longer, then we can keep going.
Okay, and we have, yes, I've had the go ahead from headquarters. Excellent. So anyone who has to drop off, we completely understand. But we do have still lots of participants and lots of questions. Ryan, like I said, you have been listening in patiently, and Will, I'll get to you as well in a second. Any views on what you've been hearing so far?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of views. I think Will was kind of spot on. There is no shortage of money to invest in renewable projects. Yeah, the question is how many renewable projects are ready to invest in, and it's very easy to say that we'll go down this technology route or another technology route. Part of the problem we have in the UK, which is obviously a very developed country, is how do you get all your permissions to develop projects within a developed country? Yeah, whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's geothermal, it's not necessarily easy just suddenly to go ahead and build as much as is required. Yeah, it's very tough, in fact, as the shale gas industry found out in the UK as well. So I think we have to sort of flip it on its head and decide, well, the investment is there. What do we actually want as a country? What are we willing to accept to achieve energy security? And I think energy security is one thing, and it's definitely achievable in this country, provided people will accept a few developments in their backyard. But on the other side, we will always be interdependent on other countries. Everything to do with what goes into either a geothermal turbine, a nuclear power station, a big offshore wind project comes from all over the world, whether that's rare earth elements, which we could talk about a lot, particularly in terms of the kind of zero carbon mining we're doing, but also where these things are manufactured. Yeah, what's the carbon footprint of how these things are manufactured, how they're shipped to us? We may talk about kind of net zero in the UK, but how much are we adding to everything that's manufactured all over the world and is then imported to us? So I think investment-wise, fine. Permitting, a huge problem, not just in my world. And then this whole interdependence on both equipment and carbon footprint of that equipment, just to add more questions to a already very broad discussion.
Thanks for that, Ryan. Actually, you made me think of something very, very important, and I'd like to lean into Will to get some response on this. Data might be our savior that we know exactly what's happening where. Me as a consumer, as an individual, a person with a family, I'm trying to educate my children, but it's much easier to do when I have information at my fingertips. And I can say, if you can make conscious and mindful decisions about how you consume goods, where they come from, how they reached you, but also the way that you consume energy. We run air conditioning units and fans and all sorts of things here in Singapore, but I'm trying to make sure that my family is more aware. Data is going to help not just individuals, governments, companies. How important is this part of the equation when it comes to what the future looks like, Will?
Awesome question. I think it's overrated, if I'm quite honest. Being from a data company, you might not have expected me to say that, but I do think when it comes to consumers, to be honest, although people really care and have great anxiety about fuel bills, climate, etc., actually they're really busy doing other stuff. They're looking after their kids, they're going to school, they're doing all of this other stuff, right? So I generally think at a consumer level, actually data is not really that important. It's actually at a policymaker level, at a finance decision maker, that actually it really kicks in. And I think that's where these sort of tropes is not the right word, but these sort of casual statements around things being more expensive really need to be examined. So if you're looking at emerging markets and developing economies, actually the cheapest new power generation in many of those, majority I might say, is photovoltaics, is wind farms. You know, they genuinely are cheaper these days. This isn't me kind of BSing, they genuinely are cheaper. When you get into that, why aren't they being built in those markets? Well, actually, sometimes it's really challenging legacy contracts. So I had the pleasure of being in Indonesia last week, where fundamentally they have an oversupply of power generation from coal in Java, but they're all locked into really challenging contracts that they signed in the 1990s. They can't unwind those. They're having great difficulty unwinding those. However, they see that they would like to. And this is where the international cooperation comes in, is how do you get them and support them to unwind those faster than they might otherwise have done because of, you know, two things. One, yes, there's a climate challenge, but two, I actually think the competition, the international competition that is growing is an important driving force here. So we talked about the importance of collaboration, cooperation. There's this old trope around global challenge, global solutions. I have to admit, I personally think that's absolute tosh. The UNFCCC is ridiculously important in setting the overall direction and the framing of discussion. The 1.5 degree scenarios, the UNFCCC as a forum for essentially resolving some of these really challenging issues is super important. But actually, when you come down to it, we have seen that this aspect is just too economically important to be resolved at a purely multilateral level. You have to get down to plurilateral, you have to get down to bilateral. And that, I think, is why it's so important that actually competition between, frankly, China and the US is playing out now in climate, in energy. And you've seen probably the biggest moves, I think, in climate diplomacy or economics in the last 3 years have been this move to bilateral relationships between kind of the West, so to speak, and emerging markets and developing ones, partly because they're terrified that those groups will side with China at some point, right? Genuinely worried about that. Therefore, build up relationships, offer solutions rather than just sitting back and going, it's your problem. And then the second thing is actually in relation to that is earlier this year in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. Now, that, along with the various other bills, is an Inflation Reduction Act, but it's also a massive energy security and don't be beaten by China act, including that plus the CHIPS Act and various other things. The competition between the US and China is driving massive investment in these things. And it's actually sad to say, I think it's one of the best things that's happening for climate and progress around climate is the sort of recognition that economics work. The West needs to work dramatically better with emerging markets and developing economies, and it needs to get its stuff together on its own domestic economies to make this work. So I think, weirdly, international competition, more than international collaboration, is actually helping us shift the needle here because you're seeing this alignment of environmental security and national security.
I don't know if Alan Lomas is still in the audience and listening, but I hope that goes some way to addressing your question, Alan. Thank you very much for that. Well, yes, you did surprise me, but lots of food for thought there. And yes, how incredible. I mean, you're sort of sad to say it, but it is what it is. And if it's working in the right direction, then down the road, we might be grateful for it. Right, I do have to wrap up shortly. So I have one last question for all of you. Andrew, I know you're raising your hand, but I have to wrap up. Otherwise, we'll go well over our allocation. So my last question, and it's the same question for all of you. I just want to go around the house and I'll start with Chris because we started the conversation with you, Chris. You're going to lead this round, which isn't actually our green transition one of the biggest opportunities of our time in terms of what we can achieve so far as energy security goes, in terms of what we can do so far as our environmental security goes? Chris, you start.
Yeah, I think it is a huge opportunity in the sense that it can, the amount of investment that we need, I've seen it quoted at £1 trillion just to do the UK. Okay, some of that's in distribution systems, some is in upstream rather than energy production. Yes, I think it is an opportunity for jobs growth. And despite comments that have been made about, yes, we need to source some of our equipment from other countries, it also gives us, I think, more energy robustness. So in that sense, it's a great opportunity. But it will be more expensive, I think. And renewables are great and they are cheaper, but they don't generate all the time. So we have to have either overcapacity or some kind of storage, some combination to optimize that. But yes, overall, I think there are a lot of opportunities.
Thank you, Chris. We didn't manage to talk too much about storage. We probably have to have a whole other talk about the possibilities. Susanna, before we lose your connection, is this the biggest opportunity of our time?
I think absolutely. And I think very much such as what Chris was just saying, you know, climate and our reliance on fossil fuels has created not just a changing planet, but it really serves as a risk amplifier. So we're, by having a just green transition, we're not just changing the electricity, the energy sources that we're using, but we're addressing habitat, we're addressing biodiversity, we're improving livelihoods, we're improving health of people, of the environment. So in that same way that climate change causes all of these crises and chaos around the world in so many different sectors, addressing a transition can do the same. So it's not just about energy, but about security, about all sorts of sectors, both for us and for the world.
Susanna, thank you so much. And I'm so glad we were able to see you for most of that one. I'm going to go to Ryan next.
Well, given that this is my core area of business, I'm bound to say it is a huge opportunity. Yeah. But I think it is for a number of reasons, and I think much as the kind of Ukraine crisis has pushed up prices to a very high level, I think it's also helped to focus people's minds. So I think we have a combination of both a very sort of turned on youth. We have a lot of young people who are very concerned about climate change, but now that's mixed with a lot of older people who are perhaps, I hate to say it, were less concerned about the climate, but more concerned about how much they were spending. So I think this is a unique opportunity. It's kind of one of those inflection points where we do change course. And I very much think that the youth will help to sort of carry us forward on this sort of immense opportunity that it is.
Thanks for that, Ryan. And on that note, I just want to say that John Catherall, Physics 1972, had written in saying climate change plus energy security, etc., is a wicked problem of the first order, one that carries existential risk, and went on to say a few other things, but yeah, absolutely understandable why it's galvanizing our attention. Andrew, I know that you also have history, you in the fossil fuel industry. In terms of this being an opportunity, it's also an opportunity for the fossil fuel industry to transition to something cleaner, something more acceptable. I said at the beginning, needing lubrication oils or all of those sorts of things for your electric car or whatever machinery, we're still going to need all of that. But there's a lot that the big oil companies can do to assist in this transition.
Definitely, and it is a massive opportunity. The point I was trying to make is I do have to run to my next meeting. Sorry, so I'll be quite quick. The one thing about data, I would say that data and that industry creates 2.5% now of global emissions. That's more than the aviation industry. Those single-use files are causing a big impact. Yes, fossil fuels can transition. Some of them are doing it better than others. If you look what Bernard Looney did at BP when he first came in, he went for it. He said, we have to do this. He's was and it still is committed to it as far as I'm concerned. The whole company and the investors said, well, you've got about 6 months and you're either going to be a savior or out of a job. As it turns out, he was in the right place. Others may be in a different way, but yes, I mean, the chemical industry and the petrochemical industry have been producing hydrogen for ages. So, I mean, for us, that's not the ideal way to produce hydrogen, but it's hydrogen nonetheless. They do have huge amounts they're investing into offshore wind, into solar, more so now that they're getting a bit of pressure. So I do have history, but then I switched, and after studying, climate change and working on discussions and helping people push it forward, when I finally left the forum, I decided I wanted to do something practical myself, and hence the hydrogen industry. Yes, they've got lots of money in the fossil fuel area. Yes, if they position themselves as energy companies, that works very well. You've seen Shell being taken to court. There's no way they can avoid it. It is such a massive opportunity, but also a massive existential risk.
Andrew, thank you so much for that. And thank you for holding on. We'll let you, if you have to dash, please do. And with that, Will, you very patiently waited. You can have the last word. Is this the biggest opportunity of our time, and what are we going to see from here on out?
Yeah, but it's going to be a pain in the ass working through it. And I think the key thing is we should be confident that we can. To me, there's a high degree of rhetoric and fear and anxiety essentially percolating through society at the moment. And I think it doesn't speak to the huge amount of effort, but also results that are happening underneath, and the progress that has been made on power generation, the progress that is being made on transport, the progress that is being made in figuring out in these sort of hard to abate areas like steel or chemicals or aviation, what the solutions might be, and also the challenges around the emerging markets and developing economies. So ridiculous opportunity, but also I think we should face it with quiet confidence that actually the dynamics are broadly with us, that actually the innovation that we're going to see as humanity is going to see us through this, and that actually we kind of, I hate the phrase, but we probably need to lean into this because actually we're going to deal with it. And I think that's enormously encouraging.
Thank you. That's a really positive note to end on, and I apologize for using the term lean in as many times as I did. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. I think what we've realized actually is this is a very, very complex topic, and it was wonderful to be able to bring all of your opinions and experiences to bear in this conversation. I thank you all for your patience, for your time, and of course for your energy. I also want to thank our audience who are joining us. We have quite a large number still with us, even though we've run a little bit late. So I apologize for that, but thank you so much for hanging on, and thank you for all the wonderful questions. I hope, Ollie, that we will be able to address some of those questions after the fact. So it just remains for me to thank all of you, Chris Elston, Ryan Law, William Young, Susanna Hancock joining us from Egypt, which is fantastic, and thank you for holding on. And of course, Dr. Andrew Hagan, and in absentia, I'm thanking him. He had to rush off for a meeting. Thank you all. That's it from me. Ollie, back to you.
Yes, well, I agree. Thank you very much to all of you for such a fascinating talk and for giving up your time to provide us with such important insights and knowledge. Manish, you did very well to cover so much in just over an hour, given it's such a huge and diverse topic in terms of both energy sources and solutions. So thank you, Manisha. I agree. Thank you to the audience for your great time and questions and comments in the Q&A. And I don't know how it works, but I imagine Emily will be able to get back to you with any questions if anything is pertinent you want an answer on that wasn't answered. And before you go, just on behalf of the association, I did want to leave you with two important dates. One is the association's AGM on Tuesday, the 31st of January at 1 p.m, where we'll be able to update you on the association's initiatives and see if you want to get a bit involved. An email will be coming out to confirm the date and the meeting soon. And for those of you who can get to London, please buy your tickets for the London dinner on the 7th of February. This is the first one we will have been able to do since 2020, so it'd be great to have a really big turnout. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day, and I declare that the webinar is now over. Thank you.